Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to InfoGamer. For this video, we're going to continue on with our Photon 2 tutorials. In the last lesson, I showed you how to create a quick start matchmaking system. And in this video, I want to show you how to create a delayed start matchmaking system. Now, if you remember, a quick start matchmaking system allows the player to just click one button, and that one button will connect them to a Photon room and load them into the multiplayer scene. In a delayed start matchmaking system, we'll still have just one button, and when the player clicks that one button, it will connect them to a Photon room. It'll also load the player into a solo game or a waiting room scene, and then once enough players have connected to that room, it'll start a countdown, and once that countdown reaches 0, it will then load all the players into the multiplayer scene and start the game. Now, before I show you how to create this system, let me demonstrate what we'll be creating in this video. And so I'm going to click play in the editor, and then I have to wait for it to connect to a Photon server. Once it's connected to a Photon server, I'm going to click play now. And that'll load us into this waiting room scene that I've created. And down at the bottom, you can see I have a couple of different UI elements. Over here on the left, we have a display for the number of players in the room out of the total room size. We then have a cancel button, which will take us back to the main menu scene. And then over here, we have a countdown timer for when the game will start. I'm then going to open up this standalone build that I've created, and I'm going to click play now. And here you can see that it's also loaded my standalone into the waiting room scene, and we've connected to the same Photon room. You can see that we now have 2 players in our room out of a total of 4 players, and our countdown timer is counting down, and once it reaches 0, we should then load into the multiplayer scene. And there we go, we've now loaded into the multiplayer scene that I've created. And just to double check, I'm going to expand my hierarchy, and here you can see that I have 2 Photon player game objects. Now there's a couple cool additional features that I've added into this delay start system. The first feature that I'll mention is that when you change the size of the room that you create, it'll also change what's being displayed in the waiting room. And so if I change our room size to something like 3, and then I play through our game again, you can see here that it now displays that we have 1 player out of 3 players total. Another great feature that I've implemented into this add-on is the countdown timer. The countdown timer will only begin once the minimum number of players needed to play the game have joined the room. And so if I go to my standalone and I connect to this same room, you can see that the countdown timer begins. But also when I leave the room, you can see that it resets the timer back to 30. I've also made it so that when the max number of players have joined the room, it will shorten the countdown timer to 5 seconds. Now I'd like to remind you that we do have this delay start matchmaking system as a Photon 2 add-on that you can download for free off of our website at infogamerhub.com. I've also put a direct link to that download in the description below this video. But now that I've showed you what we'll be creating, let's get on with the lesson. So first things first, if you haven't seen the first video of this tutorial series, then go back and watch that video and then come back to this one. In that video, we show you how to set up the Photon 2 plugin inside your Unity project. Now you don't have to watch the last video we did on how to create a quick start matchmaking system, but if you have seen that video, then it will definitely help you in this tutorial. So here inside Unity, I have a new scene created, which is my delay start menu demo. Now for those of you that have watched our quick start tutorial, you'll realize that this scene is very similar to our quick start menu demo scene. And so to create the scene, I first started by resaving our quick start menu demo scene as the delay start menu demo scene. But for those of you that haven't seen that lesson, let me walk through each game object in this scene. So first off, we have our main camera and our directional light, which are default objects that come with any scene that you create. Next up, I have our network controller game object, which is a game object that we created in that very first tutorial. So make sure that you have that. We then have our delay start lobby controller and our delay start room controller, which are very similar to the quick start lobby controller and quick start room controller that we created in the quick start lesson. We then have 2 empty game objects that I've renamed to delay start lobby controller and delay start room controller, and then they have scripts attached to them, which we'll talk about in a second. But for now, let's focus in on the canvas game object. For the canvas game object, I just have a panel, which is my delay start menu. On this panel, I have a text game object, which is for my title, which is this infogamer-delay start. I then have 3 buttons, one called loading, one called delay start, and one called delay cancel. For the text of the loading button, I just have loading ... For the text of the delay start, it says play now. And for the text of the delay cancel button, it just says cancel. You'll then need to turn off the interactable option of the button component for your loading button. And then for the delay start and the delay cancel button, you'll need to disable these objects in the hierarchy. And then we have our event system game object, which is automatically created when you create the canvas. So now that we've talked about the setup for our menu scene, let's talk about the 2 new scripts that we have for this scene. The first script I've called delay start lobby controller, and the second one I've called delay start room controller. Now we want to open both of these scripts up in our coding environment. Now for our delay start lobby controller, this script is pretty much identical to our quick start lobby controller script that we created in the last video. And so if you have that script, you could just duplicate it and then rename the script and the class and some of the variables. Or you can even just use that same script if you've already created it. But for the purpose of this tutorial, I've created a new version. If you already have this script, then you can go ahead and skip to this time. And so for those of you that don't have the Quick Start Lobby controller, let me walk you through this script real quick. So first off, you're going to need to include some namespaces up at the top. The first one is using photon.pun, the next one is using photon.realtime, and the last one is using Unity Engine. You'll then need to change your class so that it's inheriting from monobehavior PUN callbacks. Next up, we have some variables. The first one is a private game object called delay start button. The next one is a private game object called delay cancel button. And the last one is a private int called room size. And all of these variables I've made serialized fields so that we can initialize them in the inspector. Next up, we have our first function, which is a callback function for when we first initialize a connection to the Photon servers. This is a public override void function, which is called onConnectedToMaster. Inside this function, we need to set the automatically sync scene property to true, and so I have Photon network.automatically sync scene equals true. We then need to activate our delay start button, and so here I have delay start button.setActive, and I'm passing in true. Now at this point in time, our game is just going to be sitting idle waiting for the player to click the start button. And so we need to create a public function that we can pair to that start button. And so here I have this public void function which I've called delay start. Inside this function we want to disable the start button and enable the cancel button. And so I have delay start button.setActive and I'm passing in false. And then I have delay cancel button .setActive and I'm passing in true. We then want to try and join an existing room if one is available, and so I have photon network.joinRandomRoom. Now this function is going to have 2 outcomes. Either we successfully join a room or we fail to join a room. And let's handle the failure first. And so here I have another callback function, and this is a public override void, and the callback function is onJoinRandomRoom. It needs to be spelled exactly this way. This function then has 2 parameters. The first one is a short, which is called return code, and the second is a string called message. Now if we fail to join a room, the most likely reason for failing is that there is currently no room available. And if that's the case, the next thing that we want to do is try and create our own room. And so inside this function, I'm calling our create room function, which I've created right here. This is just a void function. And inside this function, the first thing that we need to do is create a unique name for our room. And so here I have a local int variable called random room number, and I'm setting it equal to random.range, and we're passing in 0 for the first parameter and 10,000 for the second. The next thing that we need to do is create our room options. And so here I have this local variable, which is of type room options, and it's called room ops, and I'm setting it equal to new room options, and then we're initializing some values. The first value is the isVisible variable, and we're setting it equal to true. We then have isOpen, and we're setting that equal to true, and then max players we're setting equal to room size, and we're casting it as a byte. On the next line of code, we're actually creating the room, and so here I have photon network.createRoom. For the first parameter, we need to pass in the room name, and so I'm combining the string room with our random room number variable. For the second parameter, we need to pass in our room options, and so I'm passing in room ops. Now this function is going to have two outcomes. Either we successfully create a room or we fail to create a room. And so let's handle the failure first. So here I have this new callback function, which is a public override void function, and it's called onCreateRoomFailed and needs to be spelled exactly the same way. For the parameters, we first have a short, which is called return code, and then a string called message. Now the most likely reason for failing to create a room is that there already exists a room by the same name. And if that's the case, then we just need to try and create another new room. And so I'm calling our createRoom function. Now the last thing that we need to do inside the script is create a function that we compare to our cancel button. And so here I have this public void function, which I've called delay cancel. Inside this function, the first thing that we need to do is disable the cancel button and re-enable the start button. And so here I have delay cancel button dot set active, and I'm passing in false. And then I have delay start button dot set active, and I'm passing in true. And then the last line of code inside this function is where we need to leave the room that we're trying to join. And so I have photon network dot leave room. So that's everything that we need inside this script, so we'll go ahead and save the script, and then we'll go over to our delay start room controller. Inside this script, the first thing that we need to do is add some new namespaces up at the top. The first one is the using photon.pwn. The next one is using Unity Engine, and the last one is using Unity Engine.SceneManagement. We then need to make it so that this script is inheriting from monobehavior PUN callbacks. Inside this class, we have one variable, which is a private int, which I've called waiting room scene index. I've also made this variable a serialized field so we can initialize it in the inspector. The next thing that we need to do is register the script to the callback functions of our Photon plugin. And so I have public override void on enable. Inside this function, I have photon network.add callback targets, and we're passing in this. You can then copy this on enable function and paste it down below. You'll then need to change the name from on enable to on disable, and then from add callback target to remove callback target. This will make it so that we can execute callback functions that are being triggered in other scripts. For example, this onJoinedRoom function is being triggered in our lobby controller script. And so you'll need to create this callback function. This is a public override void function, and it's called onJoinedRoom. This function will be executed whenever we either create a new room or we join an existing room. Inside this function, we want to load into the waiting room scene. And so I have sceneManager.loadScene, and then we're passing in our waiting room scene index variable. Now that's everything that we need for this script, so let's go ahead and save it, and we'll go back to Unity. Inside Unity, we need to select our delay start lobby controller game object, and then you'll need to attach the delay start lobby controller script to the inspector. You'll then need to set your variables. I have our delay start button here and our delay cancel button here. And then for the room size, I've set it to 3 or 4. Doesn't really matter. You could set it to 10 or 20. We'll then select our delay start room controller game object, and you'll need to attach the delay start room controller script into the inspector. You'll then need to set the waiting room scene index, which I've set to 1, which corresponds to the build order of our scenes. Now the last thing that we need to do for this scene is set the on-click events for our delay start button and our delay cancel button. For the delay start button, we need to drag in the delay start lobby controller to the on-click event. We're then going to use the drop-down menu to go to delay start lobby controller and then select delay start. For the delay cancel button, we need to also drag in the delay start lobby controller to the on-click field. And then we're going to use the drop-down menu to go to delay start lobby controller and then delay cancel. Now that's everything that we need for this scene, so let's go ahead and save this scene. You're then going to need to create a new room, which I have right here. This is my delay start waiting room demo scene. Inside this scene I have a main camera and a directional light. I then have an empty game object, which I've called delay start waiting room controller. And we'll talk about the components that are attached to this game object in a second, but Well, let's go look at the canvas. This canvas is also very similar to the canvas that we have in our menu scene. We have a title, which is this InfoGamer waiting room. I then have another text object, which is our player count display. I then have a button, which is called delay cancel. And I have another text object, which is called countdown display. And then finally, we have our event system. Now for your game, this scene should have some sort of playable single player mode in addition to what we have here in order to keep the players interested in your game while they wait for other players. But now that we've talked about the setup for this scene, let's talk about the script that we have in this scene. So I'm going to select my delay start waiting room controller, and here we have our delay start waiting room controller script. Now let's open up the script in our coding environment. The first thing that we need to do in this script is include some new namespaces up at the top. Here we have using photon.pun and using photon.realtime. We then have using Unity Engine, using Unity Engine.scene management, and finally using Unity Engine.ui. We then need to make sure that this class is inheriting from monobehavior PUN callbacks. And for this script, we have quite a few more variables. The first variable that I've created is a private Photon view, which I've called my Photon view. The next two variables are private int variables. The first one is called our multiplayer scene index, and the second one is our menu scene index. And these are both serialized fields. The next two variables are also private ints. The first one is called player count, and the second one is called room size. The next variable is also a private int, but this one is called min players to start, and this is a serialized field. The next two variables are private text variables. The first one is called player count display, and the second one is called timer to start display, and these are both serialized fields. The next three variables are private bool variables. The first one is called ready to count down, the second one is called ready to start, and the last one is called starting game. The next three variables are private floats. The first one is called timer to start game, the second one is not full game timer, and the last one is called full game timer. And the last two variables are also private floats. The first one is called max wait time, and the second one is called max full game wait time. And these are also serialized fields. Once we have all of these variables, the next thing that we need to do is initialize some of our variables in the start function. And so right here, I have my Photon view equals get component, and we're looking for a Photon view. We then have full game timer equals max full game wait time. We then have our not full game timer, and we're setting it equal to max wait time. We then have timer to start game, and we're setting that equal to max wait time. After we initialize these variables, we're then calling this function here, which is our player count update function. I'm creating this function right here, and this is a void function. Inside this function, we want to update the display for the number of players we have in our room, and we also want to start the countdown timer if we have enough players. So the first line of code inside this function, we have player count equals photon network dot player list dot length. This will get the number of players that we have in our room. We then have room size equals photon network dot current room dot max players. On the next line of code, we want to display the current number of players in our room out of the total room size. And so I have this player count display dot text equals player count, and we want to combine that with a colon, and then we also want to combine it with room size. This will make this all one string and save it into the text value of our player count display. Next, we want to check to see if we can start the countdown timer. And so I have this if statement where we're checking to see if player count is equal to room size. If this is the case, then our room is full. And so inside this if statement, I have ready to start equals true. I then have an else if statement where we're checking to see if player count is greater than or equal to min players to start. Inside this if statement, I have ready to count down equals true. We then have an else statement, meaning that we don't have enough players to start the game. If this is the case, then we want to set our ready to count down equal to false and our ready to start equal to false. Now, one thing that I forgot to mention is that in our delay start room controller, we have our onJoin room callback function. This function is called whenever we join a room or we create a room. Inside this function, we are loading into our waiting room scene. In our waiting room scene, we have our delay start waiting room controller. Now, if this scene is loaded, it means that we've already joined a room. And so our start function is just as good as the onJoinedRoom function. All right, so we've handled what happens when we join the room. Now let's take care of what happens when other players join the room. And so down here, I have this callback function, which is onPlayerEnteredRoom. You'll need to have public override void. And the parameters for this function are a player called newPlayer. Inside this function, the first thing that we need to do is call our player count update function. We then need to synchronize the countdown timer across the network, but we only want to do this if we are the master client. And so I have this if statement where we're checking to see if Photon network .isMasterClient is true. If this is true, then we need to send an RPC, and so I have my Photon view.rpc. I'm then passing in the string name for the RPC function that I'll show you in a second. The target that we want to send it to is rpctarget.others, and we're going to pass in timer to start game as a parameter. So now let me show you what this RPC function looks like. So here I have a private void function, which is called RPC send timer, and then we have a float parameter called timeIn. We then need to make sure that we tag this function as a PUN RPC. Inside this function, the first thing that we're doing is we're setting time to start game equal to timeIn. We're then setting not full game timer equal to timeIn. We then want to check to see if timeIn is less than full game timer. If this is true, then we want to set full game timer equal to timeIn. This will make it so that if a player joins after the timer has already started counting down, that their timer will then be updated to be the same as the master client. After this function, we want to handle what happens when a player leaves the room, and so we have this callback function, which is onPlayerLeftRoom. This is a public override void function, and it has a parameter of player called otherPlayer. Inside this function, all we have to do is call our player count update function. So that takes care of all our callback functions for this script. Now let's move on to the update function. Now everything that we need to do within the update function, I've placed inside this function called waiting for more players. And I've created that function right here. This is a void function. And inside this function, the first thing that we need to do is check to see if our player count is less than or equal to 1. If it's less than or equal to 1, then we're going to call this new function, which I'll show you in a second, which I've called reset timer. I then have another if statement where we're checking to see if ready to start is true. If this is true, then it means that we have a full room, and so we're going to start our short countdown timer. And so I have full game timer minus equals time.delta time. On the next line of code, I have timer to start game equals full game timer. We then have an else if statement where we're checking to see if ready to count down is equal to true. If this is true, it means that we have the minimum number of players, but not a full game. And so we're going to do the long countdown timer. And so inside this if statement, I have not full game timer minus equals time.delta time. And then on the next line of code, I have timer to start game equals not full game timer. Outside this if statement, the next thing that we need to do is format our timer so that it looks better when we save it into our timer to start display text object. To format it, we're creating a local string variable called tempTimer, and I'm setting it equal to string.format, which is a function. And the first parameter that we're passing in is this string value, which will format our timer into a time format, where this is minutes and this is seconds. The second parameter that we're passing in is our timer to start game. On the next line of code, we have timer to start display.text, and we're setting it equal to tempTimer. The last thing that we need to do inside this function is check to see if our timer to start game is less than or equal to 0f. If this is true, then we also want to check to see if starting game is equal to true. If this is true, then we want to return. If it's false, then we're going to call this start game function. But before I show you the start game function, let me show you the reset timer function. So right here I have this void function called reset timer. Inside this function, we're setting our time to start game equal to max wait time. We're also setting our not full game timer equal to max wait time. and we're setting our full game timer equal to max full game wait time. So in other words, we're resetting our timer variables to their initial values. Now let's show you the start game function. Inside this function, we're setting starting game equal to true because we only want to call this function once. You remember up here, we're checking to see if starting game is equal to true, and if it's true, then we return. But if it's false, then we call our start game function. The next thing that we want to do is check to see if we are not the master client. And so I have if Photon network.is master client. And if this is false, then we want to return. But if we are the master client, then we're going to execute the next two lines. And on these two lines of code, we want to first close our room so no other players can join. So I have Photon network.current room is open, and I'm setting it equal to false. We then want to load into the multiplayer scene, and so I have Photon network.load level, and then I have multiplayer scene index. Now the last thing that we need to do for this script is create a public function that we compare to our cancel button. And so I have this public void delay cancel function. Inside this function, we have Photon network.leave room, and then we have scene manager.load scene, and we're passing in menu scene index. So this function will be for the cancel button that is in our waiting room scene, and the other cancel button that we have within our lobby controller script is for the cancel button that is in our menu scene. But now that we have all of this, let's go ahead and save all of our scripts, and we'll go back to Unity. Back inside Unity, and with our delay start waiting room demo scene loaded, I want to select our delay start waiting room controller game object. We then want to attach our delay start waiting room controller script to this object in the inspector. We then need to set our variables, and so for the multiplayer scene index, I've set that to 2, and for the menu scene index, I've set that to 0. Both of these values correspond with the build order in our build settings. For the min players to start, I've set that equal to 2. For our player count display, I've set that equal to our player count display game object, which is this text object right here. For our time to start display, I've set that to this countdown display game object, which is this text object right here. For the max wait time, I've set that to 30, and for the max full wait time, we want that to be 5. The next thing that we need to do is attach a Photon view to this game object, and to do this, we want to click on Add Component, and then you'll search Photon View, and it should be the top option. After this, the last thing that we need to do is set the on-click event for our cancel button. And so I'm going to select our cancel button, and in the on-click event, I'm going to drag the delay start waiting room controller, and then I'm going to use the drop down menu to go to delay start waiting room controller and then select delay cancel. Now the last thing that we need to do for this lesson is make sure that we have our multiplayer scene and our Photon player prefab. If you watched the quick start lesson, then you should already have both of these assets. If you do already have these assets, then go ahead and skip to this time. If you haven't watched the quick start tutorial and you don't have these assets, then let me show you how to create them real quick. So first off, we need to create a new scene, which I have right here, and I've named the scene multiplayer scene demo. Inside the scene, all we have is our main camera and a directional light, and then an empty game object called game setup. Let's go ahead and look at this script in our coding environment. Inside the script, we first need to include some namespaces up at the top. The first one is using photon.pun, the next one is using system.io, and the last one is using Unity Engine. The next thing that we need to do is go inside our start function, and inside our start function I'm calling this function here, which I've called create player. This function is a private void function, and inside this function all we need to do is call photon network.instantiate. For the first parameter of this function, we need to pass in the file location for our Photon player prefab inside the resource folder. And so I have path.combined, and then I'm passing in two strings. The first string is going to be the folder that we're saving our Photon player prefab in, which I've called Photon prefabs, and it needs to be spelled exactly like this. For the second string, I then have Photon player, which also needs to be spelled exactly like this. The second parameter of this function is going to be the position that we want to instantiate this object at, and so for this I just have vector3.0. And for the last parameter, we need the rotation. So I have quaternion.identity. Once you have this script, we can go ahead and save it, and then we'll go back to Unity. Back inside Unity, you just need to make sure that you attach your game setup script to this empty game object that we've created. Now let me show you how to create the Photon player prefab, which I have right here. This is just an empty game object which I've named Photon Player, and it needs to be spelled exactly the same way as we have in our script right here. We then need to attach a Photon view to this object, and so we're going to use the Add Component drop-down menu, search Photon View, and it should be the first option. I've then also attached a capsule object to this empty game object so that we can see it within our scene. But you'll actually want to disable this capsule object when you're not testing your game. Once you have this Photon Player object created, you'll then need to make it into a prefab. To do this, we need to create a new folder in our project window called Resources, and then you'll also need to create another folder inside your Resources folder called Photon Prefabs, and it needs to be spelled exactly the same way that we have in our script right here. Once you have these folders created, you'll then need to select your Photon Player object and drag it into your project window. Once you've made this into a prefab, you can then remove it from your hierarchy, and we'll save this scene. Now after all of this, you should have a working delay start matchmaking system, and I'd like to demonstrate it one more time. But before I hit the play button, let me show you the build order of our delay start system. So I'm going to go to File, Build Settings. First scene that we have in our build order is the delay start menu demo. The second scene is the delay start waiting room demo. And the third scene is the multiplayer scene demo. So once you have these scenes added to your scenes in build, we can then close our build settings and click the play button. So once my editor is connected to the Photon servers, I'll click play now, which will load me into the waiting room. And here you can see that we have 1 out of 4 players in our room, and the timer has not started counting. I'll then go to my standalone and I'll click play now, which will also load me into the waiting room, and now I have 2 out of 4 players and the timer has started counting down. Once the timer reaches 0, it'll then load you into the multiplayer scene, and here in the editor you can see that we have 2 Photon Player objects. So that's everything that we're going to cover in this lesson on how to create a delay start matchmaking system. If you have any questions, make sure that you leave them in the comments below or join our Discord server. Also remember that you can download everything that we've done in this lesson as a Unity package, and I've also provided all of the scripts for this lesson on our website, and you can find a link to all of that in the description below. Finally, make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.